I have been asked repeatedly to do a video on successor states to the United States of America, and while I will cover that topic in this video, I think an examination of successor states requires a broader discussion of what the world those successor states would exist within would look like. Most people don't give this question realistic justice, as they only look at geography, cultural dynamics, and sometimes economic indicators or resources. But those factors only remain static if there is a smooth transition of power and no conflict between the current situation and the post-federal United States situation, which is virtually impossible. The ending of empires always and without exception coincides with large-scale population displacement or movement, conflict, and a shift in the way of life for many. This isn't always a bad thing. We like to say that the fall of Rome was the beginning of the Dark Ages. While it is true that great works of art and culture were destroyed and few were made in the early years after the fall of the Roman Empire, the diaspora from the cities to more rural lifestyles and the better treatment the lower classes experienced compared to the late Roman Empire actually caused the average standard of living to rise. The deaths in that time were generally concentrated in the cities. The invading and conquering barbarians didn't want to destroy everything, they wanted to rule it, and you get nothing from ruling empty land. The successor states to the Roman Empire reflected this as they incorporated what they saw as good elements of the conquered Romans with more pragmatic methodologies and their own cultural elements. The end result is what later fermented and turned the barbarian backwards regions of Europe into the most powerful geo-civilizational region in history. The point being that the end of an empire isn't always long-term or mid-term negative for the people in that empire. However, it is often horrible in the short term. That being said, it can be horrible in the long term, but doesn't have to. The rise of empires is often worse, especially for conquered people. For example, the Turkish conquest of Anatolia was a complete disaster for the Greek and Armenian populations in the region. And I'm not just talking about the initial conquest that was horrible, I'm talking about long term. As recently as the 1900s, there were significant populations of both Greeks and Armenians in Turkey. But as of now, they have essentially been completely extinguished from the country. These are effects that go far beyond not just the start of the Ottoman Empire, but after its fall. Assuming that just because you have a demographic majority in a region, that you will always have people in the region is a fallacy. Our soft modern times have made us forget that genocide and diaspora are real things that were used repeatedly throughout history to gain control over regions, grow one demographic over another, and gain both political and economic advantages. The Persians uprooted entire people groups and resettled them in different places to turn them into strangers in strange lands and invaders themselves, so they are forced to rely on the empire for identity and protection. The Romans also did this, as did other empires throughout history. A recent example of this is the Soviet Union, that wiped out many of the native Ukrainians and shipped in ethnic Russians to replace them in strategic locations. They also did this with conquered parts of Korea and Kazakhstan, which is why you will find a large ethnic Korean population in Kazakhstan. While we like to say X land belongs to X people, possession is 9/10 of the law. If you and previous generations of your family all live and built your life in a place, you are from there, no matter if you are alongside others who may have lived there longer. They have no more right to expel you from your homes and land than you have to expel them. Therefore, the true population of Kazakhstan was forever altered when the Koreans were forcibly resettled there. Upon gaining independence from the Soviet Union, the successor state of Kazakhstan wasn't a reversion to the Golden Horde, the Saka, or the Scythians. It wasn't even a reversion to the Turkic predecessors of the Ottoman Empire, whose true successor state was now in Anatolia. No, Kazakhstan, while technically a Soviet successor state, is not how anyone would envision a Soviet successor state. It is its own thing. Culturally unique, split between the native tribal cultural influence, Korean intermixing, and the remnants of Soviet domination. If you had asked what the Turkic successor state in the region would be, you would not have arrived at the current conclusion. Same if you asked for the successor state of the Golden Horde or the Soviet Union. An interesting side note is that in terms of geopolitical behavior, tactics, and governorship, Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union are clearly successor states to the Golden Horde and the Mongolian Empire, despite the absolute hate Russians feel for their one-time conquerors. Successor states often either idealize or loathe their predecessor state, and a state can be a successor to multiple predecessor states. This is because we live in an active, dynamic history, not a static historian's line chart. In economics, we call hyper-isolation of data ceteris paribus, which gives carte blanche to ignore anything you aren't specifically including in your analysis. In the same way, use of ceteris paribus leads to bad economics, using it in historical analysis leads to misunderstanding history, and as a direct result, current events. Another way of phrasing this is hyperfocus. When you pick one fact, which may be entirely true, and analyze it to death and feel like it is the entire reason for certain events, you are probably missing 90% of the actual cause for that event and placing all the blame or praise on the wrong person, people, or factor. An example of this would be the United States meddling in Ukraine. While true, blaming that for the entire Russian-Ukrainian war ignores every single internal Russian and Ukrainian factor that led to the war. It ignores the personal feelings and desires of powerful men on the other side. Whenever there is conflict, there is almost always some grievance that both sides can level at the other. Often this is used as the casus belli, but an impartial examination of history shows that in a great many, if not most instances, the actual cause for a war was not the one used for the casus belli. So just like if the modern media is telling you that something is true, you may want to start looking into why it might be false. If someone is claiming that this or that was the reason they invaded someone else, you may want to take that claim with an extra grain of salt. The problem with understanding modern successor states is that communications and travel today are far better than any time in human history. Even if we suffer massive wars, they will still be better than even just 100 years ago. So the territory you can seize in the right circumstances is vast. On the flip side, as the war in Ukraine shows, even highly mobile armies can be quickly bogged down by effective defensive emplacements. This means it is incredibly difficult to understand the extent of new civilizations and how far they would spread before their rivals solidify to the point where they can match them and maintain a stable border. But I think everyone realizes there are a few major factors in the United States that would have significant impact on a successor state. Obviously, there is a fundamental ideological difference between the central states championed by Texas and places like the Northeast and California. If we drew the borders generally how they currently exist ideologically, I don't think California and the Northeast would be part of the same successor state. Both coasts think they know how things should be run, and that the other coast is just a pale imitation of their own urban genius. And besides, seldom do you find separated geographical regions unifying into a single unified state. But I don't think California would survive a civil conflict. Their water situation is too precarious and easily disrupted. Rather than starvation, I think the first mass casualties of a civil conflict would be from dehydration in the Southwest. That is a danger whenever water is involved. For example, China is under the sword of Damocles from the Three Gorges Dam. If that was destroyed, the resulting internal tsunami would wipe out the core of Chinese power and plunge the entire nation into a new warring states period. As with too much water from a broken dam, the regions fed by dams and water infrastructure would quickly but more quietly die from the lack of said water. The survival of a power base in California would depend entirely on three outcomes. Either they would successfully conquer and control the regions they source their water from, they would have their water cut off and be eliminated through death and diaspora, or they would become a proxy to whoever controlled that water supply. The chaos of a civil conflict makes it hard for me to believe that the hydro infrastructure in the Southwest would survive. Any rogue actor or someone who cared more about eliminating the region rather than controlling it could do significant and near permanent damage to the ability to bring water to that region. So while there is significant manufacturing and high population density in California, I would quickly eliminate them from my roster. The Northeast is better situated with water, ports, and farmland that can't be quickly dried out, so I think they have more staying power. The problem is they are surrounded by the Appalachians, a highly independent region with extremely strong cultural identity. If they had any history of working together well, I would put money on Appalachia being a new country name in the next couple of decades. They do, however, have a decent density of ex-military, so it is entirely possible that a warlord could rise and rally that region to their cause. This would be very much like a king rising in Scotland. You would need someone with powerful charisma to unite the clans and bring cohesion to a naturally divided and individualistic land. The entire south coast from Florida to Texas suffers from similar problems. They would have a hard time feeding themselves. Fortunately, they have access to the Gulf of Mexico and share similar enough cultural identities to work together. And here is where the pivotal element appears. Texas could be a uniting factor between the farming regions of the Midwest and ranching North and the Cajun and Floridian South. This would create an L-shaped region. While it wouldn't work well as a single federalized country, it would make an excellent free trade zone or confederation. I could easily see a new country forming in this L that is similar to the pre-Civil War United States. This isn't a statement about slavery, but rather federal power versus state power. With stronger states that could defy or leave the Union, I think it would be far less likely for federal power to repeat what we see today in the United States and what has led us to this situation. I think northern Wisconsin and Michigan would reject the control of the big cities to the south, and they would have an incredibly hard time controlling them. Having spent time there myself and seen the farming, militia, and independent lifestyle up there, I would have this to say to Detroit and Chicago: good luck! In the Northwest, I think the power of Wyoming, Utah, Montana, Idaho, and eastern Washington and Oregon would completely overwhelm the suburban crescent in Washington and Portland in Oregon. The big cities may have more population, but they are completely unprepared to take control of rural territories, let alone force them to continue providing food and transportation or do it themselves. Many people hyper-focus on the question of rural versus city conflict in a civil war. Some people say the rugged nature and gun ownership of farmers and rural people will provide quick victory. Some say the sheer population and production of the cities are insurmountable for the rural people. But I would like to suggest that even if the cities overwhelm and conquer parts of rural regions, they would still starve just as assuredly as if they had been blockaded and cut off by those farmers. If you look at both Zimbabwe and South Africa, you can see when people who are not farmers take land and equipment from actual farmers that they do not maintain production, but often actively destroy the land and equipment out of short-term profit seeking, sheer incompetence, or frustration and short-sightedness. Farming is a profession and a skill set, just like any other. So if you expect city people to be able to pick up farming tools and produce food effectively, you are going to be severely disappointed. In modern times, a motivated person from the city can learn how to farm relatively quickly and adapt, but that is in a low-stress situation where the person is moving because they want to farm and want to make a lifestyle change while having access to readily available training and data. In a war situation, many of the tools and assistance available to new farmers today would not be available. And all of this is assuming that the people driven off of their land won't take their equipment with them or destroy it. Nobody is getting industrial scale food off farmland without industrial scale equipment. In the grand scheme, I do not believe cities can hold power once things become kinetic. The transition from more traditional farming methods to industrial farming has ensured that. The only hope for cities would be to trade with other industrialized nations, but keep in mind that China cannot even feed itself. The strain of feeding the United States would almost certainly break global production chains. The US is just at the line between net importer and net exporter of food. That means it produces about as much as it consumes and trades some of that for greater variety. In 2020, net US food consumption was valued at $1.8 trillion. If we only look at imports, the US imports roughly 500,000 metric tons of food daily, or 3.8 pounds per person, or 1,261,600,000 pounds of food per day, or over 460 billion pounds of food per year. It is estimated that there is a global excess food production of 1.3 million metric tons. Keep in mind, we export almost as much as we import, meaning that the number is actually less than what we actually consume. So not only would there not be a surplus the world could use to feed our cities, but there would be, at a minimum, several 100 million metric ton deficit in food production. And everyone will always feed their own people before giving relief to besieged cities. But this isn't the worst of it. The US dollar is a fiat currency. Fiat currency has a very simple value equation. The dollar's value is determined by the number of dollars chasing the amount of economic activity in the market where dollars are used. If economic activity goes up, each dollar is chasing more economic activity and the value of that dollar goes up. That is deflation. If the number of dollars is increased or economic activity goes down, the value of each individual dollar goes down, which is inflation, and everything appears more expensive. A civil conflict would put a stop to the vast majority of economic activity in the country. This would cause the value of the dollar to plummet because there is no demand for the dollars, and fiat currency is a demand-based currency. As the value falls, foreign countries using our dollar as a medium of exchange or as a reserve currency to prop up their economies will dump dollars in an attempt to limit their exposure to the collapse. This will instantly, sharply increase the number of dollars in the domestic market. Now you don't just have a decrease in the economic activity existing dollars are chasing, but a huge increase in the number of dollars chasing that economic activity. The currency becomes virtually worthless overnight. 90% of foreign exchange transfers and 85% of transactions in spot are in dollars, and the United States accounts for a quarter of global trade. Any economy suddenly losing a quarter of its international trade and the stability of US exchange and reserves, and yes, even our global enemies use our dollar for both and our major trade partners, would suffer complete economic meltdown. Some may even have asked where the other major powers are in my analysis, and the answer is that they are entering their own warring states period after suffering economic meltdowns and social collapse. Every major country is currently primed for massive internal and external conflict. If the United States enters a civil war, most of the world would descend into chaos. It is simply too large of a factor in global trade, stability, and food supply for the world to survive its removal. Us going to war with China, Russia, or Iran would have similar, although delayed, results. The economic catastrophe I predict, as they try to force us into the CBDC and social credit, will result in the same thing. At the moment, most roads lead to a new warring states period. The more broad spectrum chaos is, the more likely warlords and regional powers will pop up. If there is no big bad American global police to smack down rebellions, warlords, and self-made kings, they will start to pop up like weeds in an abandoned field. This isn't a moral statement about the United States' global policies, simply world history as seen both with and without the US Navy and NATO. Warring states and warlords are the natural state of human geopolitics. The relative peace we have experienced since World War II is a complete aberration, as we see in Africa and other warring states regions. Control over resources like food and water are what allow warlords to claim and remain in power. This is why they always seize aid shipments to either use themselves or be the ones to hand them out. They must be seen as the giver and taker of all things. This is why the World Economic Forum wants to control all the food production and your money. It is what will determine who is in power after it all comes crashing down. With old world population levels tools, farming methods, and military mobility. An army could devastate a path through a country, and most people could still become farmers relatively effectively if needed. Today, that is no longer the case. Logistics and food supply has always been important in war. It has always been the stranglehold that those in power use to control conquered peoples, and in a warring states period, it will be so again. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.